ARLECCHINO is stronger than Neuvillette. Against a Hydro Slime. Well, you heard me right. ARLECCHINO power creeps Neuvillette against a Hydro Slime and therefore is the strongest DPS in-game, no questions asked. Alright, jokes aside, ARLECCHINO is a really good unit and a super strong one at that. In fact, I will say this straight away. She is better than Hu Tao for all those wondering. And there are a multitude of reasons why that is. But is she the most violent? Is she the most diabolical? Is she the most dangerous? Is she the goat of all goats and the ultimate meta breaker everyone was expecting? No, that she ain't. But she's still pretty strong, like against a single enemy, yeah, she's stronger than Neuvillette as well. Heck, her best team can even reach rational levels of damage. For those who don't know, rational comp is one of the strongest comps in-game, consisting of Raiden, Benny, Xiangling and Xingqiu. But what holds her back is the interruption resistance issue, cause yes, she can dish out tons of damage, but her best team has no shielders, which means that unless you are able to dodge or dash cancel every attack, you are literally getting knocked around like a volleyball. And if you are wondering why interruption to resistance is so important, it's cause it prevents you from being knocked around while dealing damage, which in Razor terms translates to more damage, less volleyball. So today, we are going to be discussing the teams which will enable you to reach those insane levels of damage while also discussing their viability and comfortness. We will also discuss Constellations because she has some really insane ones which contribute to her total damage potential. And I promise you that once you see this video, you will have no doubts whatsoever regarding her damage, team comps and Constellations. But before we start, I would like to mention two things. First, thank you all for the overwhelmingly positive response on my last video, besides a few racist comments of course. I really appreciate you all giving my video a chance, especially considering my subscriber count, and I just wanted to let you know that I really appreciate that. Second, if you do have any questions regarding her that you want answered, feel free to drop a comment and I'll respond to each comment individually. Now let's get the ball rolling and start with her general rotation. It starts off with her elemental skill, followed by a burst, skill again, swap to supports and use their abilities, swap back to ARLECCHINO after a minimum of 5 seconds and use a charge attack, followed by a normal attack spam for 9 to 11 seconds. Now, if you're confused about what I just yapped, then I would suggest watching my last video to understand her kit perfectly, because that is obviously a prerequisite to understand how her kit and teams function. So this part where we switch to other units is what we are here to discuss today. Starting off with her best team, the Domimommies. This team, consisting of Kazuha, ARLECCHINO, Yelan and Benny, is the most premier, top-notch, elite comp you can get for insane damage. In fact, if we disregard the fact that you are getting knocked around like a football, this team can potentially do more damage than rational. But since most players don't play like a god to prevent getting knocked around, getting that damage is really hard unless your ARLECCHINO is at C1, since she does gain interruption resistance through that constellation. Now, I know many people don't have Yelan, so instead you can use the -1 Domimommy comp with Xingqiu instead of Yelan, and the rotation will pretty much be the same. Now both of these teams I mentioned focus more on damage than comfort, and to solve that issue we have the Dong and Mom comp, where instead of using Kazuha, you swap him out for Zhongli, ensuring survivability and comfort, but at the cost of some damage. And around these two teams revolves every other wave team you can possibly imagine. For instance, if you have both Yelan and Xingqiu but not Kazuha, then you can go with a team called the Wet Domimommies, consisting of ARLECCHINO, Yelan, Xingqiu and Benny. You can even use the Furina's Worst Nightmare comp, where you use Furina instead of Yelan, but keep in mind that gaining fanfare stacks will be kinda tough in this one since you don't really have a team-wide healer. Also, to all those who asked about Furina's fanfare working with ARLECCHINO's Bond of Life, I am afraid to tell you that Bond of Life changes aren't counted in fanfare stacks. Only direct HP changes contribute to that, meaning you can only gain fanfare points from ARLECCHINO through her burst and not Bond of Life. Now, if you don't like the idea of playing inside alongside Benny's ultimate circle, then you can replace him with Kazuha, but in Arlecchino's case, Benny's buff will be much more significant than Kazuha's buff, so expect less damage in this team. Another interesting team comp, which is a really fun one but not necessarily a strong one, is the Infinite Bond of Life comp, where instead of using Kazuha or Benny, you use Xianyun with Furina, cause that will definitely make it easier to gain fanfare points. And if you are plunging with Arlecchino, no Bond of Life will be consumed per plunge, meaning Infinite Bond of Life. But it is a double-edged sword, cause those plunge attacks won't be buffed like how the normal attacks would be, resulting in less damage. Now, all of these teams I mentioned besides the Xianyun one are pretty much the best teams you can run for Arlecchino damage-wise. And like I said before, you can do rational levels of damage with some of these teams, but where rational and Neuvillette teams take the cake are AoE scenarios. Cause first of all, you aren't getting knocked down like a pinball in rational or Neuvillette teams. Second, the comfort level in those teams is insane. For example, in the rational team, you are getting insane interruption to resistance for the entire duration of Raiden's burst, and not to mention Xiangling's burst nukes enemies all around you. So yeah, that team has AoE and interruption resistance. As for Neuvillette teams, you are already attacking from a distance, meaning you getting knocked around will rarely happen. And second, his Kamehameha can literally pass through enemies, meaning you are attacking multiple enemies at once if you position yourself correctly. And for these particular reasons, those two teams are better than the best Arlecchino team. But in an ideal scenario against a single enemy, Arlecchino teams are doing the same damage as rational, if not more. Now, whatever I have said so far doesn't mean that Arlecchino has no AoE whatsoever. No. In fact, she has quite decent AoE in her normals, which allows her to hit enemies if they are close by. And that is something you can't do with Hu Tao's charge attack unless the enemies are in a straight line. Now let's talk about the teams which everyone was expecting her to be the best in, the Overload comps. And I'll be honest, I'm not a big fan of Overload in particular due to enemies getting knocked around and you having to constantly follow them to deal damage. It's an insane damage loss in my opinion, but I can't deny that Arlecchino Overload teams are super fun, especially with Chevreuse. Also, to those wondering if Chevreuse C6 works with Arlecchino or not, since it does rely on healing, let me tell you, it works perfectly, so you can get that extra pyro damage bonus easily. A team like Fischl, Arlecchino, Benny and Chevreuse is one of the best Overload teams, with Yae instead of Fischl being second. You can also use Beidou instead of Fischl in what will be called as the Dominatrix comp. And the interesting thing about this team is that Beidou's burst actually provides interruption resistance, which is a really good thing for Arlecchino. But unless you can Meliodas perfect counter with her, good luck getting her burst back unless you have over 300 energy recharge. So overall, I would say that you are better off running Fischl instead of Yae or Beidou, even though Beidou might be better in an AoE scenario. Cause like I said, 300 energy recharge for burst unless you are doing perfect counters. You can also run another Electro unit instead of Chevreuse if you don't have her, but the damage would be less than the Chevreuse comp. Now, if you are a Lini fan, then you probably also like Monopyro comps. So, we have the finally I can use Dea comp, in which you got Arlecchino, Benny, Kazuha and Dea, who provides interruption resistance, but Dea being Dea will only provide that for 6 seconds, after which you are back to getting knocked around. So, I'll be honest, it's better to use Xiangling instead of Dea in this team comp, because at least you'll be doing more damage that way. And if you have been enjoying the video so far, then a sub to the channel would make father happy. Now, those 3 types of teams I mentioned are the only ones I would recommend running with her. But if you are a masochist, then you can run her in other teams like Meld comps, Persian comps, or if you are a Thoma fan, then Overburn comp. And like I said before, if you don't care about maximum damage, then run Zhongli in any of the teams I mentioned and you are good to go. In fact, I would personally rate the team of Arlecchino, Benny, Xingqiu and Zhongli as number 1 due to 2 of the units being 4 stars, which everyone has, and not to mention the comfortness of that team. And if you have any questions so far, feel free to ask them in the comments and I'll respond to each and every one of you individually. Now, speaking of Zhongli, I would like to shout out my friend for recommending the I am a Geo comp, which consists of Arlecchino, Xingqiu, Yunjin and Zhongli. Yunjin being there to boost normal attack damage as well as increase the attack speed if you have her C6. And speaking of Constellations, Arlecchino has some really, and I mean really insane ones, to the point where you can literally solo abyss with her at C6. And that's why I want you to look at her constellation from a perspective that each level is contributing to her becoming Sung Jinwoo or the solo god. Starting off with her C1, which increases her interruption to resistance by a lot. As an example, you can survive up to 4 Ruin Guard spin hits. And if you don't know, then Ruin Guard spin attacks is one of the strongest attacks in game, which sends all characters flying, meaning the interruption resistance you are getting at this constellation is pretty significant. Now besides this effect, her C1 also increases the damage she deals from her pyro-infused normal attacks by an approx 26 to 27%, making this constellation one of the best there ever was. So this is definitely a constellation breakpoint for her and something you should consider getting if you can. Moving on to her C2, which basically makes it so that you don't have to wait for 5 seconds for the dot effect to get to level 2. Instead, it already starts off at level 2, meaning you can immediately absorb it and gain 130% bond of life. But thanks to C2, when you absorb the dot effect, you will also do an extra AoE pyro hit whose damage is slightly less than the burst. Now this constellation in a team scenario is not that good because you will be switching to different characters anyway. Moving on to her C3, which is a really good one as it increases her normal attack level by 3, and I am 50-50 on whether to call it a breakpoint or not, but I can say that this is the constellation where you, and excuse my language, start to edge. Now let's discuss C4, which is probably the most overlooked constellation in her entire kit, since it just enables you to burst more often by providing you extra energy plus a 2-second less cooldown on burst. In a team scenario, this constellation is not that great, but from a solo perspective, this is an amazing one. Moving on to our C5, which is just 3 extra levels to burst. And keep in mind, those 3 extra levels don't increase the healing you get. Instead, they only increase the damage the burst is doing. And finally, we have our C6, which is just broken, because at this point, to put it in PG terms, you aren't edging anymore like you were at C3, because your normal attack cycle is now doing an approx 85% more damage compared to C0 normal attack cycle. But what exactly does this constellation do, you ask? Well, it basically increases the damage of her burst by a lot and buffs normal attack by 10% crit rate and 70% crit damage, which is just insane. To give you an example, you will be casually dropping 200k to 300k waves from normal attacks. Not burst, not skill, from normal attacks. So yeah, at C6, ARLECCHINO, despite being a rejected descender, rises up to claim the throne from the heavens. And you know what I was thinking? Right now, we don't have any units which are very niche bond of life supports for ARLECCHINO. But I feel that the Pyro Archon may have something either in her passive or her constellation which enables ARLECCHINO to gain even more bond of life or do more damage with whatever bond of life she has. But hey,
that's just a theory. A game theory.